All right, welcome. Today we're talking to Ken Yao. Ken and I used to work together back in our consulting days, and instead of try to tell you all the wonderful things Ken does, I figured he could just introduce himself. And Ken, what are you up to these days?
Yeah, I'll keep it pretty short. Like you said, we know each other from your previous role. I've been a cyber professional for the past decade or so. What I'm known for these days, we have a team called Cyber Operations Reporting and Engagement. Uh, I jokingly say it's just a skill set and a team, but depending on what the clients pay us, we do many, many things from a cybersecurity standpoint. But we're known for strategy, operations, metrics. I'm personally known these days in the role to be working closely with our customers, helping them translate their needs and their journey into requirements or into the things that we deliver from a consulting services standpoint. So all over the place, but my own background comes from a pretty diverse mix. I think I actually started more in finance, and there's the terminology of our technical disciplines and everything we do. I think I'm a specialist in cybersecurity, bringing together a lot of the different skills that we have. But happy to kind of go a lot of ways. And in this conversation, as I said before we started, happy to kind of take the journey less, the path less taken here with the group.
Okay. Well, on that note, how does one go from finance into cybersecurity?
Oh, I mean, from a personal standpoint, it goes from, and this was the pitch back when I first started in consulting, but the pitch was, hey, I know how to work really hard. I can pick up a lot of the skills that you would need to be successful no matter what field of consulting and work you do in cybersecurity. But 5 years from now, let's bet on the guy that works really hard for 5 years rather than betting on just the person with the skill at the moment that you're looking for. So I think that was the pitch. But I actually started investment banking before in finance, and I came to the conclusion that wasn't for me, just due to kind of the work style and like actually some physical health issues that I developed. So I ended up being back in the U.S. and deciding that, hey, I'm going to go for whatever presents itself to me as the next best option, which at the time was university recruiting and consulting roles.
Interesting. Yeah, so kind of like I used to always like to say you need to have like a skill coming into, any new role. You need to have something that you can do to contribute, and then you can build the rest of your skills from there. What would you say when you came into cyber was the most translatable skill that you had?
Yeah, it was definitely communications, right? So like I used the skill around, so back in college, I had started a finance club. So it was the investment club on the campus of UC Irvine. And that's what I used to kind of pitch and to explain of like, hey, we started a club. The main purpose of the club is to enter into, RFPs to propose money and to manage money for, large organizations. So very good at, I guess it's kind of coming full circle, but very good at the proposals, and being able to take ideas and be able to kind of pull them together, logically explain how we're doing things, and to then execute on what we're promising.
Yeah, that makes sense. So like a little bit of like the softer skill, and then you acquire the harder, like technical edge, the ones and zeros of cyber. I'm very curious. We have been, so the setup is we've been going around to different universities and other kinds of educational settings, talking about their cyber programs and how they're preparing people for a career in cybersecurity. And I think it's probably fair to say that cyber education is a relatively new phenomenon. I don't think it existed when either of us came into the field. And the question I keep coming away asking myself is, do I think I would be better prepared for a career in cyber having had a degree or some sort of like formal education in cybersecurity? And I'd love to say that the answer is yes, but I'm not entirely sure. And I guess kicking it back to you, do you feel like you would be better positioned, in your career, in your journey so far in cyber, if you had some sort of like formal cyber education from like a 2 or 4 year university?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I can share a little bit from, so, being in the part-time master's program for NYU and kind of comparing it to like you said, I don't think most people before us, our time as well, cyber was just a thing and kind of the evolving industry in terms of the skill set, and people were going down that path with a very technical background, or at the same time, again, a lot of people just happened into it. I think perhaps to some degree, you and I both happened into it, and the timing and everything else for cyber. So there's two sides to it of like, from a technical standpoint, and if you were to be a cyber analyst or work in a SOC or kind of understanding the skill set day to day, I do think, the education helps there. Everything about the career is that everything else there is to to take care of, like the passion and the work ethic behind all of it. So again, backing up a little bit, I was and am still probably pretty terrible in school, right? Like I did not have the discipline. I lacked the willpower to do things like, like cardio. It's like cardio, right? Like I feel that that's like kind of a self-inflicted pain, something that I have to constantly, reframe my mindset for. And I think like school was that experience where like I really had to build the work ethic over time, right? Like I know how much it has to contribute to the success and everything you build, but that in and of itself was not specific to a certain domain or a certain area. That comes from like just overall understanding, how to be a professional, and that's what my journey was. Spending the time in school, starting this club, learning what it takes to really like be an owner, to lead something, to be responsible for others, and to kind of taking that on. So that's the journey that ultimately led me into what I would say was, a form of professional services, whether it was in finance or in consulting. And then, yes, cyber happens to be my specialty because that's what I read about. That's what I get plugged into. That's what I do. And I really enjoy it. I enjoy our work, when it comes to talking about the impact and how to translate and tell that story and to, secure our clients and to make everything better like that. But from a journey standpoint, I think each individual person has to reach that point where they can take on those types of responsibilities and perform at the level that, we're oftentimes looking for in a cyberspace.
Yeah. It's really interesting that you say that you weren't that great in school. And it's also kind of funny because your opening line was like, here's the person who works really hard and can acquire new skills. And somehow that didn't translate to school. And I bring that up to say, I also did not do that well in school. And to me, I think it was kind of like a application problem. Like I don't learn well for the sake of learning. Like I'm interested, but like as soon as I've like figured out a thing, like I move on, and like my interest level like wanes significantly unless there's some sort of practical application. And so like thinking about my own journey into cyber, it started with like a very practical need. Like I had to figure out a thing, like, and then it became my job to do that thing. And I think that's probably why I got so good at it, and maybe why, my experience in school, wasn't as fruitful as maybe other people's experience. So I don't know what that says about you and I, but I think it also says that, you don't exactly have to crush it in school to be successful, though you should work hard and study, to anybody who's going to take that as advice.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. You said one other thing early on when you were describing what you're doing now and kind of what you're known for in translating customer problems. So you're in consulting. Customers have like a set of issues, and you help them on the journey for like maybe like a strategic, what do you need to do? But very fundamentally, do you find that organizations that you work with have a strong grasp on what their needs are?
I think they're usually informed on what their needs are. Does that actually translate into their actual needs when we go forth and kind of deliver? It is hard to say, right? Like I think it's usually there's an ask. So along the lines of the journey and the way the consulting engagements work, we're not necessarily at the beginning of the journey. We're kind of at the ready for discovery part of the journey, where they bring us in and have that conversation as to, hey, what do you think we should be doing? What does good look like? How do we drive some of this integration of what we're doing and building something for the longer term future? Or for larger companies, at the most advanced level, like you would see in financial services, a lot of times is, hey, we need a second opinion, right? Like we want someone to come in here and simplify things and take a look. So I think a lot of times when customers come to us, it's there's an ask, but whether it's like the exact refined ask depends, and that reflects a little bit on the capabilities and what we bring to the table, right? Like sometimes it is again really out of the box. I think consulting comes in three flavors. One is assess, second is build, and third is to optimize, or in some cases, augment their team. And those are basically the three flavors of everything we do.
Gotcha. So they know they need things. They're coming to you to figure out, I guess is what you said, what does good look like? And last week when we were talking to Ryan, he brought that up too as kind of a question, like, what does good look like? And I asked him a little bit about, well, what does good look like? And he, I think, pulled from his experience and said, well, I know that, based on my experience, it should be this, that, and the other. And I think that's interesting, but probably, very limited scope, right? From like one person's experience. So I'm kind of curious, how do you approach answering that question when somebody comes to you and says like, well, what does good look like?
Yeah, I should have started with this of the most provocative statement to get you clicks, but the most provocative statement is cybersecurity should be free. Right, like that's what good looks like. It's that it's so built in, it's so integrated into the systems, or the organization is so good at doing what they're doing that it's already kind of baked in. So going back on that statement, right? Like what do I mean by cybersecurity should be free? Cybersecurity is a part of risk management, where you're managing the risk against being exploited or attacked by bad threat actors, inside threats, etc. That's part of managing your business, which goes back to the financial, reputational, whatever else types of risks and harm and damage that can come from not managing a risk or the actualization of the risk into reality. So that's actually a lot of times how we're so hindered in cybersecurity on telling the story. It's so hard to get that translation all the way through because, hey, every customer, every company has such a unique snowflake business, right? Like, because it is. That's why they make money. It's because of the uniqueness of their business and how they choose to make those decisions. Again, stemming from this journey mindset I would have of taking ownership, being the one driving and making certain decisions, growing what you're doing and building something. So cybersecurity boils down to two messages of how are we making things more effective? How are we being efficient about it? And that's what good looks like, right? Like the good things that you can do demonstrate those qualities and really tell the story by showing what does good look like, how do you baseline and compare against your peers, and then ultimately how are you driving that efficiency across and prioritizing your portfolio of work.
Yeah, that makes sense. To double click on the first thing you said, which was your headline, right? Cybersecurity should be free. I actually think it's getting freer, but by being freer, it's potentially going to get more expensive. And by that, I mean, if you look at like the major cloud platforms where so much of the cyber responsibility and workload exists, those cloud service providers, think AWS, GCP, Microsoft Azure, they are baking in security. They always talk about security by default and, traditional things such as like network controls are free parts of like basically every product and service. And then the overarching costs for like higher level security monitoring on top of their services is getting, at least in my estimation, cheaper and cheaper. But that's only one part of the problem, right? Like assume all of that is just rolled into the cost of delivering the service. To your point, everybody's a I guess you shouldn't say everybody's a snowflake. I used to like to say everybody's data and technology fingerprint is different. How everybody uses technology is different, why they're using it, how they have things configured. the intentionality behind what they're doing is very unique and very personal to those organizations. And when you only exist at the technology layer, you only exist at the, like, I observe actions and I can make this assessment of what's suspicious, but I'm making that same style of assessment for everybody, and I know how everybody uses this technology is different. There has to be this translation layer of, like, well, what is relevant to me? I know what you're telling me you think is I should look at, but that's probably, 9 out of 10 times, you're probably telling me stuff that isn't relevant to me because you just don't know, my sphere of institutional knowledge and, like, why I'm doing what I'm doing. And I'm talking now as an organization level. And that part is just going to continue to be expensive. There's talent shortages. There's a lot of offloading to service providers. It's just a very people-intensive job, or has been a very people-intensive job for a long time. And so I guess I'm curious, I see the technology becoming cheaper, but the demands on the people continues to escalate. And those people are a real cost. So do you see the world differently? Do you see a different type of free cyber, or are we kind of speaking the same language?
I think we see it very similarly, right? Like, I think it's because the flip side of what we do from a cybersecurity, the offensive side of cyber, is a people-driven nature. And that's why it's so dynamic as well. It's, until we believe AI will, like, solve and be, like, at the people level, that's the issue, where you have to kind of adapt and adjust and be ahead, or, try to be ahead, or try to be managed in terms of priorities to stay and to be able to shift and to, defend what you need to defend in your enterprise. But there is, again, that whole intricacy of, like, how do you trace, and you talked about all, like, Azure and AWS and everything else. So I think that's definitely they're building it in their part, the full end-to-end integration. So let's use the phrase automation as, like, our buzzword bingo. So there's task level automation, there's process automation, there's integration automation, and there's decision automation. I think each thing has a way to play in that space. So you have all of our people and vendors and everything else working at the task and the process level, driving those integrations where we can see them. You have the integration across platform with the APIs and different tools and systems and acquisitions, or even tech monopolies, platforms, in a sense, where they bake it all in together. But getting to that point of maturity around decision automation is really tough, because, again, you're countering decisions being made by another party, and you're trying to think about, like, all the different examples of what it could be. So to get to that point, and to comfortably get to that point where all of the decisions are automated, is quite scary, right? And we're definitely not there yet as an industry. But that's the goal, right? Like, automation is meant to drive that efficiency and effectiveness. Definitely a buzzword bingo thing of, like, what does it mean in cybersecurity sense? But it's the goal, a line of maturity as we kind of take operations and get to that stage.
Gotcha. So you're thinking once we can fully automate decisions, then we start to effectively need less humans in the loop, and that's when things can start to get a lot cheaper. Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's...
It reaches some level of, like, a kind of a boiling point. But I don't think that it'll go too far beyond that. To your point, like, I think cybersecurity as a problem is not a company by itself's problem, right? Like, there's a lot of these different stages in which this conversation and the industry itself, whether you're talking about the ISACs and organizations collaborating across companies, you're also looking at it at, like, the nation state level as well, right? Of, like, okay, what's priorities for us as a country? And how do we provide solutions and services that benefit and kind of protect our interests?
Yeah. What is your thought there? I mean, just, following that line of thought, what is the responsibility of a nation in defensive cybersecurity? So we hear all day long about offensive cyber, but defensive cyber, and not in the context of themselves, but in the context of, people in organizations within their, I think domicile would be the right word here. And the thing I used to always tell my dad when I was talking about cyber, sometimes it can feel like you've got the local Walmart, you've got the employees out there with like, rakes and shovels and stuff like that, trying to, fend off a foreign army. There's just such an asymmetry in, skill set and funding and whatnot. And so anyways, that's how I used to describe it, but I'm curious, what do you think about, how active a role a nation can have in defending people and organizations?
Yeah. I feel both of us don't, ironically, through our past experience, we work for a company that's very in the national space. However, I think for us, it's really hard to say, right? Like, I think there's the individual level, again, that nations can help and protect, and that's almost a privacy question rather than a cyber question, right? Like, hey, how do we manage the data? How do we take care of our people and make sure that there's not, whether foreign or domestic, interests being exploited there? But I think the political landscape of cyber has changed so much in the past decade, right? Like, cyber is now another one of the battlefronts, right, that we see, and in the wars and everything else. It's one of the areas that are first to be exploited, almost, because it's better than firing a missile, right, or theoretically. But when you're getting to the point where people are able to affect critical energy systems and securing or harming infrastructure around like water, power, yeah, it's pretty crazy that all of that's happening. So I think, from what I believe in policy, it's always been a deterrent, right? Like, hey, we have our capabilities, and fortunately, the U.S. maintains that of having some of the best capabilities. But it's a deterrent, right? Like, okay, let's make sure we're able to have a stance on it, national cyber policies, and kind of the global stance on what we should do in case. But that's a huge,
that's a huge topic. It is. Oh, and you bring up such a good point. I mean, obviously the way the question's set up is you want to say yes, like, please protect me. But then the other side of the coin is privacy. Like, what information do I have to provide you for you to be effective in protecting me? And the answer is a lot, right? Like, you need a lot of information. You need very granular types of information and access in order to really understand what's happening. And then by giving up that access, now, what else is going to be done with that information, and you don't know. So that's. And
I would just say, like, again, it's at different levels, right? Like, hey, can the government protect me at the aggregate and make cybersecurity free to me, aka do something about with my tax dollars, build some sort of ability or kind of preventative measures in place. When it comes to the companies, like, okay, how can we build it into the understanding of the cost of business and the risk posture that we take for us to be able to, solution cyber and properly budget, and also measure that in scope of the rest of our business and where we should be investing, how do we push and how do we grow in certain markets. So again, at the company level, I think, which is mostly our focus, effectiveness and efficiency of how do you execute the cyber priorities.
Yeah. My mind's whirling on that topic now. When you said entering different markets, it all came rushing back to me. So some of the challenge here is also, then we can get off of this. These big multinational organizations exist all over the place, and the interests of the, local government and the politics can be so different, and that can create a lot of issues as well in terms of, even like attribution risk. Like, if you're a global company and you've got a presence in the U.S. and in China, and there's some sort of like cyber spat, like, you probably don't want to take a side on, who's doing what, because by doing that, it can affect your standing in a particular place or another particular place. So, yeah, a lot of challenges there that you think, like, cyber's hard enough, and then you layer all this on as well. Well, one, kind of coming back to your cost angle one more time, I definitely get what you're saying about, like, cyber should be free and cyber trending, like trying to trend towards free. But we know right now that it's not free, right? Doing cyber costs money. And and especially in the times we're at right now, there's a lot of people who think that there's going to be some sort of like economic downturn. You see a lot of big tech layoffs. And so organizations are probably going to look to cut budgets everywhere, right? If they need to, do some sort of austerity measures. And cyber being a cost center, should be or could be right in the eye of that. I remember we used to talk a lot about how do we message around cyber ROI, the return on investment of investing in a cyber program. And I remember it always being kind of like a funny dance, but I'm curious, what is your perspective on cyber ROI? Is it the right thing to think about? And if it is, how do you build that case on what it is?
Yeah, it's funny because, like you said, I think you and I both come from a background where we like to solve the problems, right? And not being able to apply what we're learning, in school led to a loss of interest. So that's literally this question is what I remember, like day 3 on client site, my manager at the time threw at me, how do you solve cyber ROI? And it's kind of stuck, right? Like in this horrible itch that I can't possibly fully scratch. But I do my best these days. So to kind of get into it, again, I think cyber being a cost, tying to risk, tying to the uniqueness of the business. So there's a lot of different models out there for how you can calculate risk and the valuation. I think most of them are not properly one size fits all. There is no good singular answer for this. You have fair model, you have the risk of loss, right? And kind of the, you want to do expected value type of calculations, look at that. I don't think that's fair, right? I don't think expected loss is exactly the way to do cyber ROI because it's so subjective. There's so many variables to it that you have to look at. So it is a bit of a communication exercise of, okay, so here's our business. What are the risk scenarios that we care about? And defining kind of the big risk scenarios of your industry and what's going on. Let's take a couple industries, for example. Technology, manufacturing, and we'll figure something out. But let's go technology. So for technology, the risk that they have is very direct to their end users and their customers, right? Whether that's privacy related or whether that's trust related or, again, the sensitivity around their data, hopefully not, nation states do stuff with it, but also bad actors will do stuff with personal data as well. So there's a very inherent part of cybersecurity to that business. And that's where it makes a lot of sense for those companies to maintain in-house ability because that's super close to their business. So the closer you are to the business, the more it makes sense to kind of keep those people and that skill set very near and dear to, that company. And then you go into the manufacturing space. Let's use that as the flip. In manufacturing, your biggest risks are around disruption to your manufacturing or, ransomware or, phishing as an attack vector. So when it comes to measuring your ROI, it's really about understanding and tracing down what are the things we're doing that are actually mitigating and solving for that risk. Again, in an effective and efficient way possible. We have a lot of these frameworks these days when you're tracing all the way through, the risk mapped against your threats, mapped against, you think you have things like MITRE ATT&CK, and then you have that measured by your different controls. That's your ability to detect, respond, and recover from those various types of, potential things happening and the likelihood that you attribute to it. I think visibility is also a really big metric too, or something to measure and use to understand just how blurry the glass is. You need to have a good idea into your visibility, which, in statistics terms can translate to your confidence level into your numbers and your view.
Yeah.
So I think that's really it. The risk and the calculation and the value you assign to it and being able to tell that story. You also have the flip side for various companies on cyber insurance. So I think that's actually a very, in the finance world, you have these different ways to value and you actually weigh them all, right? It's called a football field. You end up with a various football field of stratifying your calculations. And I think insurance is a good counterbalance because that tells you how other people are thinking about it. And it also provides you the avenue to sell what you're doing or to, outsource or to, again, transfer your risk to another entity.
Yeah, I think you're right there. Insurance is, when you think of any risk, right? Like the insurance companies are the ones that understand it the best because they're the ones who are insuring against it.
Maybe. They've lost huge amounts of money, so you would like to think that they
Well,
are
yeah.
smart about it. But they're getting better, aka the premiums are rising, right? Like, and they're putting more terms against it, so I think it's just so evolving, and that's what makes cyber so attractive to people like you and I. You would think they would make money because, again, it's insurance, right? But no, they haven't in the past, years that have been there.
It seems impossible not to make money doing insurance. But I think you're right, because I was going to bring that up, that the policies are changing so drastically, like what is covered, the premium, like obviously the premiums are going to go up because the payouts have been huge, but like what is covered. And I forget where it was, but there was a breach recently and the insurance company wasn't going to pay because like two-factor authentication was not enabled. And like maybe they claimed that they had two-factor everywhere. And so then it's like, well, they're changing their understanding of risk. So maybe it's just something that's hard to quantify. And the two-factor thing, just an aside on that, everybody talks about like, oh, you should have two-factor authentication enabled. Like, great. I will enable that everywhere I can, but you can't enable it everywhere. And that's one of the hard things that, I've learned in our journey right now is you can put a lot of protections around like where you have control, but we end up doing a lot of work with, partners and vendors and stuff like that. And, maybe we should be doing a better job, interrogating what their controls are. But like we have a lot of them that are like pretty, business standard companies, and they don't have a way to even have two-factor authentication on their accounts, and they don't have a way to like join our like company, do like a single sign-on or something like that. And so like, you hear the story and be like, oh, of course, like we would turn on two-factor authentication, but it's like, well, you do it where you can, but controls are so inconsistent. And this is even beyond, multi-factor or two-factor. Like cyber controls are just so different across different platforms. And the way the world works is you're integrated with everybody's platform and you're kind of at the mercy of, what they have configured for you to do. So just an aside there, I wanted to propose something to you on this topic of ROI. I heard something really interesting a couple of weeks ago. I went to a cyber conference at Appalachian State University, and one of the keynotes was Mark Varner, who's the CISO of Lowe's Home Improvement. And he did a really interesting talk on this topic, and his point of view was that if you think about why you do cyber, it can be boiled down in most cases to brand reputation. Like certainly there's like, some cost of loss, but like most of the cost comes from reputation. And if you sell up to the board that the value of brand reputation is business value and that the cyber program is really at its core to protecting business reputation, it gives you an easy way to quantify, quantify the ROI or the value of having a cyber program. And his point was like, well, how much is it going to cost if you have to repair the brand? Or even more simply, a lot of organizations can put a value on what their brand costs. And I'm remembering now, his point was, what is your marketing budget? You spend $250 million a year on marketing. That is the value of your brand to you. And so that's the value, like annuum of what we're protecting. And you can use that as a lever to say, like, you need to invest significantly to protect this particular value. And that's your value of your marketing budget. And by doing that, you can now have a more actuarial discussion of how much am I going to invest in almost like insurance. It's not insurance, but almost like insurance of having a cybersecurity program to protect this thing, which is my brand. But I'm curious, what do you think about that as a metric?
I think it's actually a really interesting one because if you look historically, and this is like not in the past 5 years, but even before that, like let's say, you know, the 10-year ago time frame where you look at some of the biggest hacks that were, in the news. You have the Sony Pictures hack where they leaked a movie. You have Target. You have a lot of those types of hacks taking place. And the stock price of those companies absolutely recovered and did perfectly fine, like after the incidents and after the recovery and through all the penalties and everything that happened there. So I think it's a really interesting point that it is around protecting the brand. There's also an interesting factor to it of like, it seems to be it's temporal. So like the damage and the recovery of a cyber incident is possible, given to the extent, feasible and makes sense. But I do think it's very much how that company ties to its customer. So I would feel very different about, oh no, Target got hacked and I used my credit card there and now I have to cancel a credit card just to be safe. Maybe, because the odds of them actually using your credit card are not 100%, right? Like there's usually something else to it. Versus like if my Apple ID, and that's not how Apple IDs work, but if my Apple ID got, hacked and they had access to everything on my phone and, my Google account and everything else, that damage would be huge, right? Like to me as an end user and what it is, it's still the same pieces of information, right? It's my user address or email address and maybe a password or something, as well as being able to somehow bypass, that's why I think insurance companies care so much about multi-factor, right? Like this is truly something that gets in the way of getting, exploited at a mass level. So I think it really depends on the company and how much it translates. But there are real regulatory fines that do take place now, especially as countries become more aware of how they want to protect their users' rights and other sorts of, revenue.
Yeah. I think some of that regulatory pressure makes sense because what the counterpoint I was going to make was about, the like utilities, right? Like what is the value of a brand to a utility that is, in some ways a monopoly? So, when Colonial Pipeline had their issue, right? Like you couldn't just like, oh, well, I'm not going to use their pipeline anymore. I'm going to go use these other people's pipeline because I trust them more. Like, no, there's one pipeline, right? This company runs it. They had a problem. And now that problem sets a narrative for an industry. And so at that level, it seems like the reputation, you could assign it to a whole industry, to a whole like critical industry. And at that point, it's really like, in our case, like the U.S. government's responsibility to try to protect the brand of the power grid or protect the brand of oil and gas. And the best analogy I think I can think of where this has gone wrong is in nuclear energy. If you look at what happened to nuclear programs post 3 Mile Island, which, certainly wasn't a cyber thing, but it was a big safety event disaster on the scale of, what people say could happen to electric or gas or water systems or something like that. And if that were to happen, the lack of trust in what is like effectively a privatized institution, could be, enormously expensive and time consuming to repair. And so I guess maybe tying in like, what is the responsibility of a government to protect corporations? They have a huge stake in reputation as well. So, yeah, interesting.
Yeah, and like again, this being unique to a lot of businesses and their risks, right? Like, so we will work with a lot of our clients to tell that story of like, okay, so when you're looking at the ROI, we're really talking about like, what's the business impact? So manufacturing, okay, you're going to stop making widgets for this time frame to take things down. It's going to lead to, potential questions and time being spent by your teams to do X, Y, Z. That's based on the likelihood. That's kind of how I think the ROI story has evolved over time. Of course, again, there's a ton of different ways where you can create the right like stratification and use the comparables to come up with your numbers on the ROI. But to have that whole picture really goes back into that enterprise tracing of your cybersecurity against your enterprise risks, against your business, and maturing that, beyond the state of just checking boxes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I want to ask you one kind of final topic, and I want to leave people or anybody still listening with something actionable that they can take away. So I'm going to set up a scenario for you. Your director or executive cybersecurity program, and your board has asked you to come present to them. You've got 7 minutes in the schedule to tell them everything about how the cyber program is doing and what you're doing to protect the organization, their reputation, their stuff. What are the top data points that you're going to pull out and take to that board meeting to get the message across on what your cyber program is doing?
Oh, so much. And these are at different levels of the people, and the messaging I think would be a little different along the way, right? Like I think at the board level, I'm communicating from a risk standpoint of here's how much we're covered, and here's how much risk we feel is exposed. Here's what I would need potentially to address this. Here's some things you might have heard in the news. Here's how we're doing about it, and here's kind of the collective outcome of how we feel about that situation, or like how that's impacting us. If I'm communicating to like a cyber oriented, like an IT cyber organization, I would be striking more the tone of like the balance of, hey, here's all of the things we're measuring against what we're doing. I would say here's the known knowns, here's the known unknown set, here's the unknown unknowns, how we're performing against those 3 categories of metrics. So a lot of times, it's time-based metrics, how quickly we're getting to something for the known knowns. The known unknowns are kind of the feeding and kind of the defense of our threat intelligence, our ability to detect and respond, as well as our, ability to address critical vulnerabilities as they're coming up and the effectiveness of that. And then the unknowns are just, what did we miss, right? What are the big things that came up, and how do we do better in that space? And to quickly just, again, incorporate, and what are the asks that I have of the audience to support that message and getting that across. I think it's definitely a very partnership-oriented mission in cybersecurity, right? Like whether, again, depending on your business, if you're working with a trust and safety team, you're working with an internal awareness team, you're working with your IT partners, the people actually managing the infrastructure, or also the application owners, the business people using XYZ tool for such business purpose. The more you can draw and connect those dots and tell a good story of end to end, here's the business process, and here's our role in cybersecurity and what we're enabling, and here's the risk to it. That's how you tell a good story in cyber.
Gotcha. So it's all about the story and about the narrative. Yeah.
And again, the story that connects with cyber sadly always goes down to your effectiveness and your efficiency, right? Like it matters to the business, it matters to the risk, but you just got to show that effectiveness and efficiency across everything you're doing in cyber. And that's how you make sure you look good, your bosses look good, and the organization does a good job.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that. Well, Ken, I really appreciate you coming on. There's so many threads I want to pull, but we'll have to save it for another time. We're coming up on time here. Before we go, anything that you want to give a shout out to or plug?
Nothing crazy. Stay in school, apply what you're learning.
Stay in school.
Yeah. I think it's important for all of us to really find that specialization, and kind of really dedication to the craft. And, going back to that earliest point, it's not necessarily about, I was trained in this, but it's rather, what is the mission or the purpose that we're here to solve and to, get people It's
a great message. Thanks, Ken. Thanks for joining us. I really enjoyed